We're on Daf Mem Tes Amud Beis, towards the bottom of the Amud. We're looking for V'chein Mishi Yotza. It's approximately, I would say, 6-7 lines up from the bottom, with the two dots Lamemra. And we learned in the Mishnah that if a person is on his way to a great mitzvah like Shchitas HaPesach, or to circumcise his son, and he reminds himself that he has Chometz in his house, so if he has time to go back and destroy his Chometz and then continue with his mitzvah of Pesach or Milah, fine. And then the Mishnah goes on to say that a similar halacha applies to a person who's on his way out of Yerushalayim, and he reminds himself that he's holding on to Basar Kodesh that became puzzle, and he needs to burn it in Yerushalayim, possibly even in the Azara, that's called Lifnei Abira. And we spoke about the fact that they will supply him in that urgent situation with Aksei Hamaracha. And the Mishnah records a three-way machlokes. What is the minimum size or volume of the Chometz or the Basar Kodesh for which he has to return in order to either fulfill the mitzvah of Bir Chometz or the mitzvah of Sreifas Kodshim Shenifsalu? According to Rabbi Meir, the shear is a kibetza. Less than a kibetza is not considered chashuv. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's a kizayis, because the Torah prohibits achila. And according to Chachamim, we differentiate between Basar Kodesh on the one hand is a kizayis, and Chometz is a kibetza. So the Gemara now is going to raise a contradiction between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, as their shitos are recorded in our Mishnah, in comparison with a different Mishnah, where their shitos seem to be recorded in the opposite direction. Instead of Rabbi Yehuda accepting the shear of Kizayis, he accepts the shear of Kibetza. And instead of Rabbi Meir, as he has here in our Mishnah recorded a shear of Kibetza, he accepts the shear of Kizayis. And this is based on an analogy to the law of Birkas HaMazon. L'meimer de Rabbi Meir savar b'Kibetza hu de chashiv, that the shear of Kibetza is the shear of Chashivas, nothing less than a Kibetza is chashuv. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, savar Kizayis nami chashiv. We can attribute chashivas to a shear of kizayis. So, what are we going to do with the Mishnah in Masechet Brachos in Perek Ketzad Mevarchim? And there the Mishnah says, "Ad kamahem mizamnin." The word zimun here in this context really means Birkas Hamazon. But you have three people eating together, and not only are they chayiv Birkas Hamazon, but they have to recite Birkas Hamazon as one unit. That's called zimun. And if they want to divide up and each one make his own bracha, we don't allow them to do so. So how much did they eat such that each one of these three members of the unit of the zimun is chayiv and Birkas Hamazon? And the Mishnah records a machlokes. The assumption here, by the way, and you'll see this all over Shas, I don't have to tell you this, that Stam Mishnah is Rabbi Meir. And the first Tana in this Mishnah, whose name is anonymous, there's no name here, is Rabbi Meir. And he says Ad Kizayis, which is exactly the opposite of what he says here in our Mishnah in Pesachim, that the shear of Chashivas has got to be a Kibetza. And we're tempted to wonder if maybe there are two different halachas. Maybe we can reconcile this and say, well, your analogy between Sreifas Chometz and Bir Kodshim Shenifsalu on the one hand, and Birkas Hamazon is not a fair analogy. Perhaps with regard to Chometz, we have a higher level shear and you need a kibetza. But why would that be so? And in addition, the Gemara continues, we have a stira in these two Mishnayos between Rabbi Yehuda Shita here and there. Rabbi Yehuda Omer in Birkas Hamazon, the shear of zimun is ad kibetza. Less than that is not considered an achila chashuva to generate a chiyuv of zimun. And here in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says the shear is the shear of achila of kizayis. So if we assume that this Tanakama in Masechet Brachos regarding zimun is none other than Rabbi Meir, how could it be that Rabbi Meir here in Pesachim establishes that Chashivus requires a kibetza, and yet in Birkas Hamazon, all you need is a kizayis? And on the other hand, the reverse is the question here in the stira Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda here in our Mishnah sets the shear at a kizayis, lowering the standard. And with regard to Birkas HaZimun, he requires a kibetza. On Rabbi Yochanan, there's no way of reconciling this stira, but rather Muchlefes Hashita. Rashi explains Muchlefes Hashita means that with regard to the Mishnah in Zimun, we have to switch things around. And we have to assume that there was some sort of mistake in the transmission, but Rabbi Meir holds that the Chiyuv Zimun requires nothing less than a kibetza, reflecting his shita here in Bir Chometz and Bir Kodshim. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, holds that Zimun requires nothing more than a kizayis, reflecting his shita here. Abai Omar Liolam Lo Tepuch. Abai tries to reconcile and differentiate between these dinim. And with regard to Birkas HaZimun, you might ask, well, why does Rabbi Yehuda require a kibetza? I mean, Bishleima, I can understand Rabbi Meir in Zimun. There the Torah says, V'achalta ubeirachta. So achalta would mean ein achila pachos mikazais, but a kazais is already chashiv enough to consider it an achila and therefore generate a chiyuv birkas hamazon. But what about Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda says that we're going to jack up the chiyuv, the requirement or volume that would require a zimun all the way up to kibetza. And Abai explains that Hasan Bekroi pligi, the machlok shim Rabbi Meir of Yehuda, revolves around the pasuk v'achalta v'savata beirachta, and there are two ways of reading that pasuk. Whereas that has nothing to do with the machlokas here. Our machlokas here in our Mishnah Pesachim, which is a twofold machlokas with regard to Bir Chometz and Sreifas Kodshim, is a machlokas b'svara. What is considered chashivus? However, the machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir in brachos about zimun has to do with reading the pasuk. So therefore, hacha over there, the machlokas is bekroi. But here, I'm sorry, that's hasam. But hacha here, the machlokas with regard to forcing him to go back home for the purpose of Bir Chometz or Sreifas Kodshim in Yerushalayim is Bisvara Pligi. Abai explains. Hasam Bekroi Pligi, with regard to Zimun, how do we interpret the pasuk V'chalta v'savata Rabbi Meir V'chalta zo achila v'savata zo shesiya? And it means the following, that a person, according to Rabbi Meir, to be chayav in Birkas Hamazon, requires two conditions to be filled. He has to, number one, eat a solid food, and number two, he has to drink a liquid food. And the word v'achalta is the standard uniform shir of achila, which is a kezayis in kol tarkula. V'savata tells me that there's a shir with regard to shasiya. And not only that, but that you have to integrate both an achila and a shasiya in order to be chayiv in Birkas Hamazon, the oraisa. Everything that we're dealing with is the oraisa. And v'achila is because ayis. And by the way, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the Sefer Yereim of Rabbi Elazar Metz, one of the Chachmei Ashkenaz, writes that a person should be very careful and drink something in his meal while he's eating, because if he wants to be chayiv in Birkas Hamazon, then he needs also shtia. A lot of people don't know that. People will eat a dry meal without drinking, and they'll recite Birkas Hamazon, which is fine. There's no problem with that. You're certainly chayiv midrabanan, but we always try to jack up the mitzvah to a higher level of the doraisa, and the Rabbi Lezer mitzvah is very sensitive to this Rabbi Meir over here. I mean, again, the most Rishonim don't even know about this. They don't. It doesn't even register on the scorecard. But just to mention the Shita, the Urayan, Rabbi Yehuda Savar v'Achalta v'Savata. The word v'Savata is not coming to add a condition of what did you eat? Did you eat not only solids but also liquids? But rather to describe and categorize that achila. It's not your general achila, which would be, as Rabbi Meir insists, kizayis, but rather it's an achila sheyesh ba svia. And what's an achila sheyesh ba svia? The Torah is demanding a higher or a greater volume in order to bridge the gap between achila and svia, and what is considered the uniform volume to achieve svia, kibetza. So the gap between kizayis and kibetza, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is the gap between achila and svia. And the Torah, again, is adding another condition for the chiyuv birkas hamazon. It's not enough achila, you need also svia. And in order to achieve svia, you need a kibetza. This is very reminiscent of sugis in Masechet Sukkah with regard to the chiyuv of Sukkah on the first night of Sukkot. Some say that the chiyuv, the Ran, I believe, and other Rishonim, that the chiyuv of yeshiva b'Sukkah on the first night requires a kvius which is not less than a kibetza. Other Rishonim say no, tesvav, and just like in matzah, it says b'erev tochlu matzahs, you need an achil of kizayis. So too, you need no more than an achil of kizayis on the first night of Sukkot. But those Rishonim, and very, this talking about Chachmei Sfarad, they require a kibetza. That's because we need a yeshiva shel keva, and that upgrades from kizayis of achila to a kizayis of svia, which is only a kibetza. You can't have a svia with achila. So you can have a chaplap achila where you eat and you run and you ate a kizayis, but if you want an achila of kvius, you need a shear of kidei svia, of kibetza. Now, there's a famous Rabbi Kiva Eger, he vacillates back and forth about this. Is the Machayev really achila, just as is a Tanai of svia, or the Machayev is an achila sheyesh ba svia? The simple pshat and reading of, the surface level reading of the text of Rabbi Yehuda would seem to indicate that svia is defining the achila. It's not just some sort of separate Tanai. Anyway, Rabbi Kiva Eger has various nafkaminas to that chakir. Hacha. Now here, Abai says we have the reverse conclusion, and Rabbi Meir is requiring kibetza, and Rabbi Yehuda suffices with a kizayis. The svara pligi. To Rabbi Meir savar, what was the svara that compelled Rabbi Meir to upgrade from a kizayis, which is universal achila, to a level of kibetza? In other words, what we're saying here is that since in Birkas Hamazon, Rabbi Meir invokes the universal halacha of achila kizayis, why should that change mismara, says Abaye, in the context of Sreifas Kodshim, and from Sreifas Kodshim we'll move on to Bir Chometz. Chazaraso kitum asa. When we talk about Kodshim Shenifsalu, the classic scenario of Kodshim Shenifsalu is when the basar contracts tumah. And that's called tumas ochlin, because basar is called ochlin. So that the mitzvah of sreifa, and in this case it means going all the way back into the bira with the atzei marocha to burn kodshim shenifselu is a reference to kodshim shenitma'u. And when we get to Hilchas Tuma with regard to Ochlin, we have a shear of kibbetz. That's the shear of Tumas Ochlin. Is therefore Rabbi Meir Sovar Chazaroso Kitum Oso. We're going to have an equation here between burning the Kodshim Nitmu and the shear of Tuma, which engendered the Chi of Sreifa. The Chi of Sreifa was a result of the fact that the Kodshim were contaminated, and that Basar Kodesh, in order to receive Tuma, contract Tuma, has to be a minimum share of kibbetza. Now, this is not so crystal clear. What do I mean? Back on Daf Lamed Gimel, the Gemara speaks about Tumas Ochlin that requires a shear of kibbetza, and that's the sugya of Rabbi Akiva there, where Rabbi Akiva says that if you have grapes that contracted tuma, you can actually, Pella v'chidush of Rabbi Akiva, you can extract the wine, the yayin, from the grapes, and if you do it in a certain way, which has to do with the shear of kibbetza and ochlin, then it's not makabel tuma. Could you imagine? The grapes are tmeim, but the yayin is not tumah. And that's called mifkad pocket, which means the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Akiva, we view the juices inside a fruit as a separate entity. And the tumah is only on the anovim themselves, but not on the wine. And then Rabbi Akiva requires the condition that when he presses the grapes in order to remove the wine should be less than a kibbetz. And therefore it's not makabel tumas ochlin. So Rashi over there understood that what was going on is that the yayin was going to be used in the context of kodshim, and what Rabbi Akiva was pointing out is that in the absence of a shear of kibbetza, the yayin could not convey tuma. But Rashi quotes another interpretation, which he's not so happy about, but many Rishonim accepted it, that not only is less than a kibbetz in ochlin a shear in being metame acherim, but it's even a shear in being mistame to contract tuma. And this Gemara here would seem to support those Rishonim, that the minimum shear for Kabbalah's tuma and the Shema Ochel for Kabbalah's tuma is a kibbetza. And therefore, when you talk about Sreifas Kodshim, when these Kodshim became Tmeim, you ask yourself first, says Rabbi Meir, the logical question, well, what made them Tmeim? What was the shear of Basar? How much of a volume of Basar did you have such that the Kodshim contracted Tumah? And here we go to the universal standard requirements and conditions for Tumas Ochlin. When are Ochlin makabel Tumah? And the answer is, you need a kibbetza. And Rabbi Yehuda is not going to deny that. That's not an issue. Rabbi Yehuda is going to come up with another svara. But now we say the following. Matum also, this is the logic of Rabbi Meir according to Abaye. Tum also b'kibbetza, af chazaroso b'kibbetza. If the shear of Tumas Ochlin is a shear of kibbetza, such that the basar contracted tumah because it had the shear of kibbetza, so too, as far as this halach of chazara, in which case the Rabbanan required you to go back and retrace your steps in order to be sorei for the truma, the same shear would apply. The Chachamim took the shear of Kabbalah's tumah and he applied it to this requirement of going back to Yerushalayim or to the Azara depending on whether it's Kodshim Kalim, for Sreif. Now we have to add another point. Where does Chometz fit into this picture? And once again, we're going to have to assume that according to Abai's interpretation of Rabbi Meir, we're dealing with Hilchas Chazara. It's unbelievable. Usually we speak about Chazara in Parakira and Shabbos, but we're talking about Chazara to force you to go back to fulfill a mitzvah. And we're going to lump together under this general rubric of Chazara both Kodshim Shenitmu for the Sreifa and Chometz Pesachim for Bir. And once the established standard of Chazara, in the case of Kodshim, is a Kibetza, then Chometz is going to be, so to speak, swallowed in or swallowed up, and it also has a shear of Kibetza. I mean, one could have said, and we'll get to the Chachamim in a minute, that, Chometz L'chud and Kodshim L'chud, but in any event, that's what we have. Now, at this point, Abai is going to really have to churn out another svara here, because Rabbi Yehuda, in the case of Yachalta v'Savata, says that the shear is Kibetza. Rabbi Meir says in the case of Chazara, the shear is Kitumasa, which is Kibetza. So then all the evidence now will point to the conclusion that Rabbi Yehuda should also require a Kibetza for Chazara. I mean, his shear in Ochel for V'Achalta v'Savata v'Irachta is a Kibetza. Rabbi Meir has a logically compelling argument that Kibetza should be the shear for Chazara because the Tum itself was engendered by a shear of Kibetza. So what do we do with Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda Savar Chazaraso Ke'isuro. Here we're going to start Taf Nun Amud Aleph. We should not set up the shear of Chazara based on Tumah, but rather on Achila. Now, I'm not sure, I'm going to suggest something and then reject it, but that it could be that Rabbi Yehuda, in contrast to Rabbi Meir, thinks that Kodshim is a Poel Yotze of Chometz. In other words, instead of starting with Kodshim and the shear of Kibetza for Tumah, let's begin with Chometz and go in the opposite direction. With regard to Chometz, there's no such thing as a sheer Kibetza. The Torah prohibits Achila and Chometz, and Achila is Kizayis. So we're going to extend the standard of Chazara, which was formulated in Chometz, and apply it to Kodshim. But I honestly, although I'm excited about that, I don't think that's the way you have to go. You could simply say that according to Rabbi Meir, we can start with Kodshim, and the Torah prohibits us from eating Kodshim Shenifsalu, and that's the Torah's Achila. And once again, an Achila Pokos Mikazayis. Now, the law is that Basar Kodesh, once it becomes possible, is Asur B'Achila. And that means a minimum of a Kizayis. Now, that's certainly true in the case of Kodshim that contracted Tumah, but it's also true in the case of Kodshim that became possible because of what we call Yotze. He carried, let's say, Shlomim, Basa Shlomim, outside of the walls of Yerushalayim. In such a case, the Kodesh becomes possible midin Yotze. And once again, the Isra Achila of Kodshim Shenifsalu applies to Yotze. And therefore, since the Isra Achila is Chal by virtue of the Kizayis, the Shir Kizayis, therefore Rabbi Yehuda says Chazara is also, in other words, again, I'm going to say something balabatish, but just for the sake of remembering the mechanics of Rabbi Meir, of Rabbi Yehuda, let's say that, again, don't take me too seriously here, but let's say the Torah says destroy Kodshim Shenifsalu because of the Isra Achila. And we find this, the Torah very often says that if there's something that's a chefza disura, destroy it. In Chometz, we have the same thing. Again, whether it requires sreifa or not, that's a different question. In the case of kodshim, the Torah requires sreifa. But the sreifa could be viewed, there's a famous brisa called Avos de Rabbi Nosson that says, Minayin sha'asasa Torah gzera lidvareha, that sometimes the Torah itself makes a gzera. And the brisa quotes two examples, the Isur Yichud and the Isur of Bal Yirah, Bal Yimatzeh. And these are the two examples that the brisa in Avos de Rabbi Nosson gives for a gzera that the Torah sets up a gzera. In other words, Asus Yag LaTorah is a mandate to the Chachamim to imitate what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does in the Torah. So let's say that Sreifas Kodshim is a way of getting rid of something that you're not allowed to eat because Kodshim Shenifsalu is Aser Achila, Achila meaning a Kezayas. And now you have an obligation to destroy these Kodshim Shenifsalu by burning them because they are Aser Achila. And that certainly applies in the case of a Kezayas. So that Rabbi Yehuda turns to Rabbi Meir and he says, Rabbi Meir, you're basing it on the fact that this Kodesh became possible through Tumah. And that's not necessarily so. I mean, the Kodesh might have become possible through Yotze. And therefore the shear of Kibetza is totally out of place. But moreover, says Rabbi Yehuda, the compelling argument here is that the Sreifa is a chiyuv that evolves because of the Yisra Achila. And that Yisra Achila applies whether it's Kodshim Shenitma'u, whether it's Kodshim Shenifsalu B'Yotze, Pigul, Nosar, whatever psulim you want to enumerate in Kodshim, the Isra is going to be an Isra Achila of Kezayas. And therefore you want to go back, you're on the way to a great mitzvah, but you want to go back home into Yerushalayim in order to fulfill the mitzvah of Sreifas Kodshim, you should do so because there's an Isra Achila in those Kodshim which generates a Chiyuv Sreifa. And therefore the shear is going to be a Kezayas. Now, if you ask me about Chometz, Rabbi Yehuda will say, well, this is understood without my explanation because Chometz is an Isra Achila which applies to a Kezayas. Now, what's fascinating to me, or almost upsetting to me, I should say, is that I can't find anywhere in the Sugya an explanation for the Shita of the Chachamim. That was the third Shita. Now the Gemara is going to offer a fourth Shita, which is Rabbi Nosson. But I'm perplexed by the third Shita, and that's the Chachamim. Chachamim, as recorded in our Mishnah, distinguish between Kodesh and Chometz. In the case of Bir Chometz, the shear is Kibetza. And in the case of Basa Kodesh, the shear is Kezayas. At the face of it, that's counterintuitive. Because Dafka, with regard to Basa Kodesh, we have a Hamamina that it should be a Kibetza because of Tumaso B'Kibetza. The shear of Tumas Ochlin requires a Kibetza. And Chometz, where does Kibetza come in for Chometz? And we wanted to suggest, according to Rabbi Meir, that they made one takana for Chazara. And since in Kodshim, the Machayev is Tumah, and the shear for Tumas Ochlin is Kibetza, Chometz becomes a Nachschlepper. But now, according to Chachamim, you're saying something very paradoxical. You're telling me that Basa Kodesh is B'Kezayas, which means that you're going with the shear of Achila, and you are allured by the Svara of Rabbi Yehuda, that the shear of, that Sreifa has the same shear as Achila. You've destroyed the Kodesh because it's an Isra Achila, which is B'Kezayas. Now, Chometz is also a shear of Achila B'Kezayas. And paradoxically, the Chachamim are saying that the shear for Chazara in the case of Chometz is Kibetza. Now, again, Rabbosai, I looked, I couldn't find anything on this. The Gemara seems to just be oblivious to the Shittas Chachamim. I don't know why. But I would like to take a stab at it. And If you like it, that's good. If you don't like it, you'll blame it on me, and that's all. That's fine. But I wanted to suggest the following: that we have a share of kibetza, according to, for example, Rabbi Yehuda in Birkas Hamazon, v'achalta v'savata. So the chashivas of an achila with regard to Birkas Hamazon is a kibetza, says Rabbi Yehuda, and no less than a kibetza. We have the shear of kibetza and ochlin. When is it considered an ochel as far as Kabbalah's tumah is concerned? We have, therefore, a number of precedents to derive the shear of chashivas as a kibetza. If that be the case, then perhaps we can understand why, in the case of Chometz, the Chachamim, quoted in our Mishnah, lower the standard and are more lenient with regard to Chazar. And they're going to say to you, how much Chometz do you have? And therefore, you're going to interrupt your trip on the way to Shchitas HaPesach or to Milas B'no for the sake of Bir Chometz. And this is all D'Rabbanan, and I'll tell you why. Because Midoraisa B'Bittel B'Alma Sagile. So now we're going to add A plus B equals C. We're going to say number one, the entire Mechayev of Chazar for the sake of Bir Chometz is only D'Rabbanan. And in fact, if he doesn't have enough time to go back and forth, we're only going to require Bittel. But in a case where he has enough time to go back and forth and continue with his mitzvah, then we're going to say, you know what? Go back and destroy your chametz. But I certainly have the option of bittul, and not only do I have the option of bittul, I'm required to recite bittul because habodek tzarich sheyavata, and that reduces the level of bir chametz to a drabanan. So Rabbanan say we're going to be mekel. He's on his way to do a great mitzvah. Hosek the mitzvah, part of the mitzvah. But we wanted to go back and be mavayir the chametz. We're not going to rely on bittul for whatever reason. But we'll be mekel. And we'll say, you know what? There's a standard of ochel, which is a kibetza. Where do you find a standard of ochel kibetza? Rabbi Yehuda says it in the case of achila that generates birkas hamazon. Rabbi Meir points out, and nobody disagrees with this, that the minimum share of ochel for tumas, ochlin, is a kibetza. So we have a precedent that chashivas of an ochel requires a kibetza. The Rabbanan are going to hang their hat on that peg in the case of chazar lechametz, because that's a case of a Rabbanan. On a Doraisa level, he was mavat. But when we get to what? To Sreifas Kodshim. And here we have a compelling svara of Rabbi Yehuda, namely, that what's Machayev Yosreifas Kodshim? It's the Isra Achila in Kodshim Shenifsalu, which you violate with a Kezayis. So there's already a Chashivus in the world of Kodshim Shenifsalu, of Kezayis. Now we want to be Machmir and force you to go back to fulfill your mitzvah of Sreifa because you already have a Kezayis of Basa Kodesh Shenifsal. I don't know. Anyway, Tanya, we have now a fourth sheet in Tanoim. Rabbi Nassan Omer Zev Kishtei Beitzim V'lo Hodu Lo Chacham. Once again, there's very little in this Gemara. Rabbi Nassan, I don't know, he's one of my favorite Tanoim, and the Gemara just completely rejects it without even making an attempt to explain why Rabbi Nassan requires Kishtei Beitzim. And that's for both Chometz and Sreifas Kodshim. And I suspect, but this needs a lot more research, that Rabbi Nassan was of the opinion that Sreifas Kodshim is only D'Rabbanan, meaning you could burn Kodshim, Shenifsalu, anywhere on the face of the globe. The Rabbanan required that you do it within the area where it became possible, which means in the case of Kodshim Kodshim, the Azor, in the case of Kodshim Kalim, anywhere in the Bira. And that rabbinic requirement lends itself to kulos, to leniencies, and therefore kibetza is going to be the shear both for Chometz because of what we discussed earlier about bittul, reducing the level of beer from a deraisa to rabbanon, and in regard to kachim, because kachim shenifsalu can be burnt anywhere on the face of the earth. The rabbanon required bira, and they're going to be making with a kibetza. Yeah, but the Gemara objects. So why do you upgrade it to 2 beitzim? How lenient do you want to get? Isn't 1 beitza enough? You're upgrading the shear of chashivas from kizayis to kibetza. And Rabbi Yehuda is yelling and screaming that the shear of achila and kodshim is kizayis. And Rabbi Meir holds that that there's a special kula here of kibetza because of Kabbalah's tumas ochlin. But shtei beitzim, I mean, that's really strange. And here I'm at a loss because I don't even have a precedent somewhere in halacha to shtei beitzim. I was thinking, but it's ridiculous. I don't even want to waste your time with this. That in Erev Tchumen we had a Masechet Erevin, if you recall, shear of Mazon Shtei Sudos. So if a Suda requires a kibetza, then Shtei Sudos requires Shtei Beitza. I don't know. Now, at this point, we have an Agadata, and the culmination of this Agadata is about Yerushalayim. At least this, this Gemara that we're learning is not as challenging for me personally as, the Gemara about Amoratzim, if you remember the very severe, harsh attitude towards an Amoritz. So the Gemara says the following. Let's take a look in Sefer Zechariah, who prophesies about the Achris Hayom. V'hoya bayomahu. Now the entire chapter there is referring to the Milchemes Gog uMagog. And Gog is going to come en masse to attack Yerushalayim. And lo yeh or yikaros v'kipaon. And this is a very strange pasuk. He has in the footnote here Mitzudas David, Rabbi David Pardo, and he says that bayomahu lo yeh or v'lo yeh choshech. There won't be neither light nor darkness. Klomar, Yisrael yu nevochim b'daiton. They won't be able to identify that period of time. Here, they expect and anticipate the ultimate redemption, and yet the adversary, Gog, is attacking en masse Yerushalayim. Below Yavchinu, they cannot determine ha'im tkufa zu hi hachana l'tshua o l'kiloyon chas v'shalom. Is this ominous of destruction, or is it the beginning of the redemption? So that's called lo yeh or, meaning it's not light and it's not darkness. But Rabbi Eliezer gives a different twist. He's not interested so much in Pshutel Shel Mikra. He wants to darshan more al pisod. Let's reveal the secrets of this nevuah of Zechariah. Ma yikaros v'kipaon, Amar Rabbi Lazar, ze or sheyakar ba'olam hazeh, v'kafui li'olam haba. And Rabbi Elazar is introducing what I call the relativity theory. And you could talk about the R of the sun. And in this world, the R of the sun is very powerful. Sunshine, in a good tropical day in Florida. I don't want to get us dreaming over here, but anyway. But relative to Olam Haba, that light is dim. The R of Olam Haba which means the Achris Hayomim is such an Or Gadol that relative to the Or Gadol of Olam Haba, the great shining light of sunshine in this world doesn't even shine a candle, we would say. And on that great day, when Gog will come to attack Yerushalayim, is going to be an Or, but that Or is not the Or Achama, which is called Yikaros, meaning we value it tremendously. I mean, so much happens because of the sunshine in this world, but yet it's not Yikaros, Loya or Yikaros, because that light will not be Yakar. You cannot give it any significance. That's only the light of sunshine in this world, but there's going to be an Ar Gadol, a great light. So it's not like the Mitzudas David, who's interpreting based on Pshuto Shel Mikra, that will be in a confused state because here Gog is attacking us. But rather, the Navi is promising us that great things will happen at the time of the destruction of our enemies and the Achris Hayom. We'll have a great light. Rav Yeshua ben Levi Omar, Elu b'nei Adam, sheyikarim hein be'olam hazeh ukfuyim hein li'olam haba. The word kfuya means secondary or insignificant. And what Zechariah is telling us is that in this world, we give all the chashivas to the rich. You know, we want to know what Bill Gates is doing or whatever it is. But in the next world, it's just the opposite. That kfuyim heim le'olam haba. There, the rich people are secondary. Ki had Rav Yosef Rei the Rebbe Yeshua ben Levi Chalash. He became ill. Ve'isnegid, and all his vital strength was leaving him. He was so weak. But Ki Hadar, he came back from the dead, and he had a resurrection of sorts, miraculously, to wake up out of this comatose state. Amalei Avua, my chazis. I guess Levi was asking Rabbi Yeshua, what did you see there? I mean, you must have already crossed the threshold between life and death. Nobody's been back to tell us, what do you see after death? I mean, you can read books about this. There are people who testify about the long tunnel and all this, you know what I'm talking about? Amalei, so Rabbi Yeshua responded, oh, this is one of those famous Haggadahs in Shas. Olam hafach reisi. Everything is upside down, topsy-turvy. El yodim lamata v'taktonim lamala. Those who have such a great chashivas, you know, in the top of the news in this world, in the next world, they're somewhere on the bottom. And the opposite, there are those who are poor people or considered shvelim, you know, they're humble people, they're not, you know, in the neon lights, they're not flashed up there on the top, splashed on the top of the newspaper, they had column there. But in the next world, Lamala, they will be on top. Amalo b'ni olam bara ra'isa. You saw the truth. What we're looking at is the falsha, the false world that we live in. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi asked the following question. Oh, I'm sorry, I got the names mixed up. I apologize. It's Rabbi Yosef who's asking his father, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Banan hechi hasam. In other words, where are we here? And you know, you got to picture a glimpse of the next world. So he answers, Ki hechi de isu anan hacha hachi isinan hasam. In other words, we will get the same chashivas, the same covet in the next world that we had in this world. Because we're not living in the world of sheker. Now, the Gemara adds a few other comments here about, you know, situations in which people, so to speak, got a glimpse of the next world. Shamati shayu omrim, ashrei misha bolakan v'talmuda biyada. there'll be a special place, a red carpet treatment for those who come to the next world after this world is ended for them, and they have their Talmud biyodam. They're holding on to their Talmud. So Rabbeinu Hananel offers two interpretations to this Gemara. In his first, he says that the same cover that they got in this world, they will get in the next world, but only if they come with Talmudam biyodam. But then he says, Ashri Michi Yavalakan Vikiem es Kol Mashalamat. In other words, he will get a royal carpet treatment in the next world because Biyado represents the implementation of Talmudo. It's not just that he's a great scholar and he understands things conceptually in Torah, he has the wisdom of Torah, but he has the Biyado. He actually implements the Torah. So that whenever his defense attorneys up in the heavenly court will present his merits, they will always quote the Torah as a proof to his chusah because he fulfilled that Torah. V'shamati shayu omrim haruge malchus ein adam yachol lamod b'mechitzasa. Now, who are these haruge malchus that gave up their lives on Kiddush Hashem? We have, of course, the Asor Haruge Malchus, which is called Rabbi Akiva and Chavero, but then we have another category called Haruge Lud. And that's just an amazing story. The Gemara tells us, and it's a Sugi in Sanhedrin, but the Yerushalmi really embellishes it. What happened was there's a libel against the Jewish people, because the daughter of the emperor was murdered, and they blamed the Jews. Of course, we're always at fault, no matter what. And because of this anti-Semitism, blaming the Jews, they announced that unless the Jews will produce the murderer, we will completely destroy the entire city, every last man, woman, and children. And two Jews who were not guilty of murdering this girl, they offered themselves and they were executed. They are called the Haruge Lud because they came from the city of Lud. So first we have Ein Adam Yachol Lamod B'Mechitzasam. In other words, there's a special mechitza in Gan Eden for those who gave up, they sacrificed their lives al Kiddush Hashem. And those are the Haruge Malchus, Uman Ninhu. Who are these Haruge Malchus who have the level that no one could reach that level? And that is Ilema Rabbi Akiva v'Chaverov. If it's a reference to the 10 martyrs that were killed al Kiddush Hashem, is Mishum Haruge Malchus v'Sulo. I mean, forget about the fact that they died a martyr's death and they were put to death by the Malchus. What about their entire lifetime? They have the credentials. I mean, these are tzaddikim, these are bali maisim tovim. They deserve to be in that special mechitza because not the way they died, but the way they lived. And this, announcement that Haruge Malchus ain't called Bir Yechol Lama B'Mechitzasim sounds like you're talking only about Haruge Malchus. So it can't be that this is a reference to Rabbi Akiva v'Chavera, because then we wouldn't have to classify them as Haruge Malchus in order to justify that they have their own mechitza. No one could be in their level in Olam Haba. El Haruge Lud. Those who came from Lud and gave up their lives. They were in fact two brothers. Lolinus and Puffus were their names. I'm not sure why they both had to sacrifice their lives. Anyway, these were brothers that were killed by Toranius, who was the terrible emperor in the city of Lud. He was the big honcho, the Roman emperor for Lud. And when his daughter was found murdered, they couldn't identify the murderer. So they said, we're going to destroy the entire Jewish community. And these two brothers took it upon themselves to give up their lives al Kiddush Hashem. And this becomes the source for what it says in the poskim, that even when you're not required to give up your life, for example, the Mishnah says in Trumas that if they surround the whole city, give us one nefesh, we'll destroy the whole city. We don't give up one life, even to save the entire city. But if that person, whoever he might be, offers on a voluntary basis to sacrifice himself, that he's allowed to do. And if he does so, he reaches this high level of Haruge Malchus that ein birya omedes b'mechitzas. Now, at this point in the Agadata, the Gemara goes back to the pasuk in Zechariah about the Achris Hayom in the same chapter. It says, "Bayomahu yeh al mitzilos hasus kodesh lashem." Once again, a very enigmatic phrase here, mitzilos hasus. My mitzilos hasus. So here we have three alternative interpretations of mitzilos hasus. Rabbi Shimon Levi Osir HaKadosh Baruch Hu lahosif al Yerushalayim ad shasus ratz umatzil. It means that in the future, Zechariah prophesizes that the bounds of Yerushalayim will be expanded, the borders, and how much of a distance, the distance that a horse will run until you would see its shadow cast. That happens at noon, a little bit after noon. So the shear of Merutzas Hasus is a half a day until you get to midday when the sun is at its zenith, and you will not be able to perceive the tzal, the shadow of the sus, because it's underneath the animal itself. The sun is directly overhead. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to be marchiv liyasid love and Yerushalayim from the bounds of the city beyond until you get to a place where the sus with its with galloping would reach by half a day. And if a sus gallops, it's going to reach a tremendous distance by midday. Now the Maharsha wants to understand, why is it necessary? What's the great godless, the Gedila Gedola here of expanding the city of Yerushalayim? He writes, almost like a Brisker Lamdan, he writes that the purpose of expanding Yerushalayim is to expand the mitzvah of Achilas Kodshim and Meiser Sheni, which are eaten anywhere within the bounds of Yerushalayim. So we want to give more room. What he probably means is that there are going to be myriads of Jews who are going to come on, who are going to converge on Yerushalayim, Liyasid Lavo, in order to eat Kodshim Kalim and Meiser Sheni. It's going to get very crowded in Yerushalayim. So we have to expand the bounds of Yerushalayim. I don't know how that's going to impact on real estate prices in Yerushalayim. That I don't know. Then we have the Shita Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan Omar. No, I skipped. Rabbi Lazar Omar. Kol mitzilos. Mitzilos are bells. They used to add or attach, I should say, ornate bells to the head of the of the horse, because the horse, the stallion was considered the great, beautiful representative of not only beauty, but also strength. And they would decorate it with these pa'amonim, with these bells, shetolim l'sus bein eno, between the eyes of the horse. And what's going to happen with these bells? Yeh kodesh Lashem. The end of the pasuk, which I don't think we read before. Oh yeah, we read it. Vayomahu yel mitzilos hasus kodesh Lashem. The people are going to contribute on a voluntary basis these ornate bells for the Beis Hamikdash. Now, what's the big deal here? I mean, were they so valuable? What were they made of? Gold, pure gold? So he says that this is indicative of or symbolic, I would say, of the Jewish dedication to Kodesh, which means the following. The idea of sanctifying something is to take something that's mundane and elevate it and upgrade it to a level of sanctity. A horse representing strength and beauty is the greatest and most intense physical object that has these traits, these outstanding traits. And li'osid lavo, we're going to take these traits and we're going to dedicate them for Kodesh. And that's what it means, Kodesh Lashem. We're going to appreciate that our strength and our beauty was given to us and bestowed by God in order to challenge us to use these great traits for the service of Hashem. Now, he has a footnote here. He says, and he's quoting the Ben Ish Chai, "Ha-posuk bo l'rameis al hasmodas Yisrael l'asilavu bi-esek ha-Torah," the total dedication to Torah study. Mishum sheminhago shel olam misha oev l'tayel konelo sus lirchov olav rechiva shel tiyul b'chol yom. So those who like traveling will buy a sus and they'll travel riding on a daily basis on the horse. And v'oselo tachshitim bein enov. And he has beautiful, ornate bells that are produced so that he can set them up between the eyes of the horse. That's all with regard to this world. People who love to go horseback riding, I would say. Achli Yosid Lavo, you call Yisrael Otrim Lifnei Beis Hamikdash Lasok B'Torah. Lo Yirkav Al Asusim L'Tiu. V'Yanichu Es Asus. Yak L'Shah Hatzorech Lirkov Me'ir Le'ir V'Chadom. So they will only use the sus on urgent occasions, when they have to travel outside the city. But not just for the fun of going horseback riding. He says, "Berechiva kazu shel ovrei drachim." What Zechariah wants to symbolically convey is that if they're going to only use these, they don't have time for tiulim. They're going to be dedicating themselves to Torah study. And it's just my only, I always have this problem with the, what is called the AACI and all that. They run these tiulim. So, I can say goodbye to you for a week. I won't see you because you're on a tiul, But liasid love, it won't be that way. There'll be such a dedication to love for Torah that'll supersede tiulim. So the horses will only be out there for an emergency situation when you really have to travel chutz la'ir. So therefore, it doesn't pay, to beautifully ornate and decorate the horses that are only there for emergency use. And therefore, ein derech lekashet es hasusim sherochven olav v'ofen aroy as ovrei drachim. Therefore, they'll take the tachshite kesef bizav and they'll be magdish to the Beis Hamikdash. And finally, we get to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, Kol Biza Shebozin Yisrael Adsha Shasus Rotz Umatzil Yeh Kodesh Lashem. He says that on that great day when we will defeat our enemies and we will be victorious against Gog, we will take the Biza and we're going to take this Biza and dedicate it to the Migdash, Kodesh Lashem. And how much Biza can they already acquire on one day? It's the amount that a horse would run up until Chatzos, until there's no longer a shadow because he's at the apex. And during this entire period of time where the horse can make a lot of progress and it's running, Klal Yisrael are out there bozizim in order to bring all this biza, all this bounty and booty as a voluntary gift to the Beis Hamikdash, as an nedava to the Mikdash. Bishleim l'man the Omer called biza shebozu Yisrael. I understand according to Rabbi Yochanan Hayin Zichsiv. That's what the pasuk means when it says v'haya hasiros bebeis Hashem k'mizrakim l'fnei hamizbeach. That even the horses will be like sirim. He talks about sirim. Sirim are giant pots that we used to take out the deshen, the afer of all the kodesh and nisrufu, or they use these big gigantic pots for bichul, for cooking in the Beis Hamikdash, all the zvachim, and they will be like kesef mizuav. They will be like silver that was gold plated, like the mizrakim, and there'll be such great biza meaning booty, that you can compare it to these great bowls, or cooking pots, which are called siros. Elamandi Omer Bahanach Tarte. In other words, if you accept Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi or Rabbi Lazar, their interpretation of this pasuk is what does the pasuk mean in the next part of the pasuk when it says V'haya hasiros the Beis Hashem? And the Gemara answers, Milsach Rita Karma. This has nothing to do with the beginning of the pasuk. This is a separate, independent segment that's telling us a whole new Besora. Demisatre Yisrael umisnavde umaisi. That the Jewish people will become rich. Right? You notice that the taf in Aramaic replaces the shin in Lashon Kodesh. Umisnavde, and they will take all this kesef izav, masses amount of precious metals, and they will contribute it for the Beis Hamikdash. And they'll take these sirim, these gigantic vessels, these receptacles that were dedicated for the Mikdash, and these are made of kesef and zav, like the mizrakim, like the kli sharis that you use for Kabbalas Hadam, and that kli will be replaced by these beautiful, expensive kelim that are made of gold and silver. And this is where we're going to stop for today. Let's just make a note of where we got up to. We're up to Bishlema Lemandion.